Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Julie, and I organize webinars here at the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. We're so thankful you decided to join us today as we host Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor. Before we begin, if you're new, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership in the conservative movement and to promote leading conservative women. We do this through a variety of ways, some of which are webinars like this, campus lectures across the country, summits, and our intensive internship program here in the office. We always like to remind all of our students and participants that each of you is a great place to begin being a conservative ambassador, wherever you might find yourself, whether that is a university or at work or in your local community. If you'd like to learn more about us or would you like to apply for our fall internship program, we are now accepting applications. You can visit our website at cblwomen.org and follow us on our social media platforms at the handle CBLWomen. We'd like to thank Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor for joining us today. She is a research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She's the author of Booked, Literature and the Soul of Me, Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, and On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. Dr. Pryor is also co-editor and contributor to multiple other books. Her writing has appeared in Christianity Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, First Things, Vox, among many other publications. She is a founding member of the Pelican Project, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, a senior fellow at the International Alliance for Christian Education, and a senior fellow at the L. Rush Bush Center for Faith and Culture. Dr. Pryor is a former member of the Faith Advisory Council of the Humane Society of the United States. She and her husband live on a 100-year-old homestead in Central Virginia with sundry horses, dogs, and chickens, and lots of books. Today, Dr. Pryor will be speaking on the importance of reading. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor.
Thank you so much for that welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you about the importance of reading. It is my passion. I have been an avid reader since I was a little girl, and I was the proverbial girl with my nose in the book all the time. And of course, that was long before there was social media. And I will later talk a little bit about those struggles, because that struggle is real, the kinds of things that digital media is doing to our brains. But I grew up reading, became an English major in college, went on to get a PhD in English, and now teach English. And there are a few things that I want to say about the importance of reading. There's many things, but today will be just a few. I want to start by saying that reading is a conservative activity. That sounds sort of obvious, I think, but it's worth thinking about a little bit, because we exist right now in a time in culture and in a place in the Western world where we have existed in a print culture for, my math is not that good, but about, roughly 500 years, I would say. The print culture really elevated and rose in the 17th and 18th centuries. And we all know what it has meant to be the product of a print culture. I mean, the American Revolution and the founding of this country are the result of people who read, and materials that were printed beginning early on in the 17th century, with a lot of religious and political pamphlets that fueled the English Civil Wars and fueled both the French and American Revolutions. So certainly there's reading can be conservative, it can be revolutionary, but ultimately it conserves because it allows our thoughts to be preserved in writing, not just for, forever or close to forever, but even in a smaller sense, in the sense that we can have something in front of our eyes and look at a sentence and think about a sentence in a way that is more reflective and more in depth than when we're just listening, as you are now. I mean, I'm probably talking kind of fast, and maybe you're not taking notes, and that's okay. You don't have to take notes, but obviously the words that I'm saying are kind of slipping in and out of your mind. But when something is printed and we hold it in front of us, it's preserved and we can think about it. We can go as slow as we want to go. We can go back and reread something. And so just on a very basic level, there's something about print culture that is preservative and conservative. One of my favorite works on this topic, which is very profound and very revolutionary, it changed the way that I thought about so many things, yet it's written at a lay level, is Neil Postman's classic, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he talks about the history of print culture and the difference between a culture that is rooted in the printed word versus what he was writing about at that time was the age of show business and television, which of course we've gone even further than that. But I highly recommend that book to you if you're really interested in thinking about the conservative nature of print, and how printed material encourages and extends and cultivates a kind of rational, logical thinking as it exists in time and as it unfolds word by word in time. It is inherently something rooted in logic and linearity, which is, again, the basis of argument and reason. The kinds of things that we don't see very much of out there on the internet these days. Again, something I'll talk about more later. So that's just sort of a little philosophical, political foundation for the importance of reading. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about my own experience as a reader and what it's done for me and how I've written about that. So the first book that I wrote almost 10 years ago now is called Booked Literature and the Soul of Me. And it is a literary and spiritual memoir about the books that changed my life, the books that had the most impact on me as a person. I was someone who grew up in the church and was a Christian from a young age and very involved in church my whole life. And yet somehow books, classic works of literature, taught me things about life and taught me truth and helped me understand the world in ways that I just didn't get out of church and Sunday school. I think I do understand those things now, but it was really the stories contained in the pages of great literature that helped me to expand my world far beyond the little rural Maine where I grew up, and helped me to understand the things that I was thinking about and the questions that I had in ways that were healthy and ways that helped me to explore ideas without actually kind of going down the path that many destructive ideas can lead us. And so when I wrote Booked, I had, by that time, been an English professor in a Christian university for some years, and I was writing really to an audience that I think was probably too limited in their reading and too nervous about reading. I mean, I started teaching when I was getting young people who were debating, who came from families where they weren't necessarily allowed to read Harry Potter or even The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I was getting a lot of students coming from backgrounds where there was hesitancy and reserve and a censorious attitude toward reading. And when I wrote Book, the first chapter sort of launched my whole philosophy toward reading, which is based on the thinking and writing of John Milton, the 17th century Puritan poet and pamphleteer, who was part of the English Civil Wars. And he wrote a famous pamphlet called Areopagitica, which is one of the first early modern arguments for essentially free speech. He doesn't call it that, but it is a work that laid the groundwork for our own First Amendment that would be established a century or so later. And in this pamphlet, Milton, who, remember, is a conservative Puritan who's just helped to, his movement has helped to behead the king, and Parliament is now in power. And Milton's own people, his fellow Puritans, were wanting to issue licenses to anything that would be printed. Remember, this is the beginning of print culture. And Milton was arguing that Parliament should not be in the business of allowing or disallowing material to be printed. Now, remember, this was in a context of civil war where people were dying and being killed for their religious and political beliefs. And Milton was saying, let people read heretical and treasonous works of literature. He said, because he basically was arguing that it was anti-Puritan and anti-parliamentarian to have an approach to licensing literature. And so he uses a phrase in this wonderful pamphlet. You can find it online. I really encourage you to read it. It's very powerful because he's writing from a specifically Christian perspective and using a biblical basis to argue for free speech. He argues that if you hold to doctrinal truth, but you don't know why, and you only hold to it because your pastor tells you this is what you're supposed to believe, that is actually heresy. And so he argues for reading contradictory points of view and argues for what he calls, or he describes, books promiscuously read. And so from his phrase, I argue in my book for reading promiscuously. And of course, Milton was using that word in its more literal sense. It's come to be used in a particular context today, but the word promiscuous actually just means inordinate mixing. So like reading things, a mixture of things, things that don't necessarily line up with our beliefs and our religious doctrines, but to be exposed to other views so that we can actually examine our own and adhere to them genuinely and truly. And so in book, throughout all the chapters, I describe the different works of literature that shaped me and changed my thinking from childhood on through to adolescence and adulthood and marriage, and then finally, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and my career. And through all of that, really, it's the books that brought me back to God, because I just had this sense, for whatever reason, when I was growing up, that to pursue the life of faith and to pursue the life of the intellect were like two paths that didn't go together, and I would have to choose one. Of course, that was wrong. But it wasn't really until I was even in my PhD program that I realized that that not only was that wrong, but the two do go together, that the words and the stories that I love are possible because of a God who is the Word and who is the Logos, and all words and all stories come from him. Our human ones are not necessarily true, but there's something, the fact that we can actually have them and weigh them and judge them against the standards of God's Word is because there's something in his nature reflected in words and stories. So that was just liberating. And I literally did not discover this until I was in my PhD program. And that's when I began to mix together my faith, my love of literature, and even my politics, my conservative politics. So I detail that story a great deal in Booked. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote another book that's less personal, but more philosophical, more a study of what happens when we read. And that book is on reading well, finding the good life through great books. And what I wanted to do in that book was, after writing Booked, where I argued for reading widely, about 10 years later, 8 or 10 years later, when I was working on this book, something happened, something changed, and that was the rise of the internet and social media. And I realized that that a lot of people are reading widely these days, very, very widely. We've got blogs, and we've got Twitter, and we've got Facebook, and we now have fake news, and we have disinformation and misinformation, and we have satire sites that seem like they're real, that people think they're real. We just have so much information, and we are reading it. We are in a little bit of a different state than that that Neil Postman was writing about when he was talking about the age of television, where we're consumed primarily with images. Now we have images and text, and it flashes and switches and changes, and we're reading all the time. We're scrolling. If you're like me, I'm projecting here. We're scrolling on our phones, and we're reading tweets, and we're reading Facebook posts. But that is a very different kind of reading. And so I went from wanting to argue that we need to read widely, which I still believe, but we also need to read well. And so that's what On Reading Well obviously focuses on. And what I mean by reading well, I mean a couple of things. I mean a few things. And first of all, I will say off the bat that that I agree with the cognitive science that shows that we read differently when we're reading the printed page versus when we read on a screen. Now, I know there are things like, Kindles that are supposed to replicate a page and don't have any ads or pop-ups, and maybe that's somewhere in the middle. But essentially, when we are reading Twitter or Facebook or websites or blog posts, the science shows that we are using the front part of our brain, which stores information for shorter periods of time and has shorter term memory. And those skills that are used in reading that kind of material are exacerbated, or that shallowness is exacerbated when we have all these pop-up ads and these headlines and all these things that are trying to distract our attention. But when we read a book that we hold in our hand, we actually read from the deep recesses of our brain, where we hold information more for a longer period of time. Now, I've read enough in my life, both in books and on screens and on phones and so forth, that I can feel the difference. I actually feel the difference. Even when I'm holding a book, I can tell that that part of my brain is so weak and so atrophied that it's a struggle to just keep on reading without checking my phone. We all know, we've seen the articles, the science, the engineers and the technicians who've worked on these things in Silicon Valley have come out, and some of them have left the industry and some of them haven't, but they have shared that they actually build things into these devices and into these technologies to keep our attention, to keep us coming back. The dopamine hits that we get from a like or a retweet are real, and they keep us engaged, and they get us addicted. They get our brains caught into a pattern that is hard to break. So if you feel like that's what's been happening to you, it's true. And maybe some of you are so young that you don't know anything else. And as someone who is not that young, I want to tell you that life and my brain were very, very different before the digital age. So the good news is that, like any other muscle, we can strengthen it. So we can strengthen those areas of the brain and those critical thinking processes that are required when we read books, and that are required even more when we read literary works, which again, cognitive science shows that we respond differently to literary fiction in particular than we do to just sort of superficial, shallow beach reads. The science shows that people who read literary fiction feel more empathy after reading a literary story than they do when they read just an entertaining story. And they surmise that's because what literary fiction does that other entertaining stories don't do is to use language in a way that requires us to make judgments, to make predictions, to empathize, to guess, because literary fiction shows us, it doesn't tell us. And so we have to use those parts of our brain that we also use in real life when we're listening to a friend tell us a story, and we are trying to help the person, help our friend navigate through something without having the answer in front of us. Literary fiction requires sort of similar brain functions from us because of the way that it uses language. So again, we go back to what I believe is a very inherently conservative nature of language, of the written word, of what it does to our brains, what it does to us as social creatures. And beyond that, of course, there are all kinds of theological implications that we don't have time to get into today. So one of the first things that I am talking about when I'm talking about on reading well and what it means to read well is to read books as opposed to just tweets and blog posts and newspaper articles on our screens. Read books and read good books. Read literary fiction because literary fiction or poetry or drama, literary art isn't about informing us, it's about forming us. So we can get information from a lot of sources and we can read that information the same way that we do read newspapers or read reports. But when we read literary art, we aren't getting information. We're actually being formed as people. Again, going back to that cognitive science, we're being formed in our empathy and being formed in our ability to think critically and to make judgments and assessments and predictions. It's a very different kind of activity. And I think not realizing that is one source of frustration for readers who are accustomed to reading information and doing that quickly. Because when we sit down with a literary work and try to read it the same way, it doesn't work. We have to read, in order to read well, these kinds of works, we have to read slowly and reflectively, engage, go back and reread, enjoy, luxuriate, think about the words that are chosen, think about the sentence structure. This kind of reading is not reading for information. You cannot skim Charles Dickens. You would not, there's no point in reading Charles Dickens if you want to skim him. All of the joy and the pleasure and the formation of our brains and our character is in the way he uses words. The stories are delightful. You know, if you want to go on SparkNotes and read the summary of the story, I suppose you might think, oh, that's clever, that's interesting. But that is not what it means to read Charles Dickens or any other great literary writer, because literary art is not about what is told, but how it's told. And that's, again, the formation aspect. When I'm teaching literature, I constantly urge my students to think about the difference between form and content, and then how the two work together. So often in this world, which is very utilitarian and very pragmatic, and you know, especially where you guys are, I know that world a little bit, and it's very much so. We mainly want to know what's the point, what's in this. But literary fiction, literary art is not about the content, it's about the form. I mean, imagine going to the National Gallery, one of my favorite places. I love to visit there when I'm in DC. You don't go to the National Gallery to see what a vase of flowers looks like, or to see what a little girl with a watering can looks like, because we already know that. We go to look at those paintings and those sculptures, not because of what they depict, but because of how the artist has depicted them. The skill, the technique, the power that comes through that can't quite be put into words just because of how the light shines on one part of the face versus another part. That communicates something that is far beyond the object in the painting. And the way a writer writes communicates so much more than just the SparkNotes or the CliffNotes summary. And we have to train our brains to engage with language in that way, because it's a very, very different way of engaging than just skimming the Twitter feed or skimming an email that you get from work, so you can get the information that you need. And so on Reading Well, I just further expand on this idea by focusing on a number of classical virtues, and talk about different works of literature that can show us, not just by the lessons that they give, but just really show us how various virtues work out in life, even if it's fictional life, so that we can learn what virtue is, and we can learn how to detect it in life around us or in stories around us. And we can, that's part of what it means to read well, is to allow literature to form our character and to shape us. Now, it's not as simple as simply, oh, if I read good books, I will be a good person. Or if I, engage in, if I appreciate good art, I'll be a good person, because there are very evil people who have lived on the earth who've been connoisseurs of good art and good music. It's not about that, but it's about the power that good art does have if we will receive it and exercise those parts of ourselves, including our character, because as Aristotle says and taught, and I quote him extensively in the book, the virtues that a virtuous person has begin as practices that become habits, that then become second nature. And when they are so much a part of our character that we don't even have to think about it, that we have practiced kindness so much that it's become a habit and we don't even have to think about it, we are just naturally kind, then we've attained that virtue. Or when we practice courage so much that we don't even have to think about acting courageously, we have attained the virtue of courage and prudence and humility and diligence and so many more. And in this day and age that is so polarized, there really is nothing more than virtue that I think that can help us make our way out of it, because virtue is, by definition, the moderation between two extremes, an extreme of deficiency and an extreme of excess. And all around us, in politics, in social media, in our churches, in our families, in our conspiracy theories, and in our news, we have primarily the extremes. An extreme one way or an extreme the other way. We have the extreme, I'll just pull up one controversial example. We have the extremes who sort of deny that racism is a problem anymore because that's all over and done with. And then we have another extreme that perhaps sees it everywhere and wants to take every book out of the canon in the classroom that doesn't represent racial minorities at all or well. Those are two extremes over and over. No matter what issue we're talking about, we see the conversation being dominated by extremes. And I want to argue that those of us who know how to read, and we read widely and we read well, are going to be the ones who are best equipped and able to forge a different way, a virtuous way that avoids excess and avoids deficiency, and perhaps can bring some virtue back to our political climate, and bring some virtue into our own lives and our own relationships. And I learned this primarily through reading, and maybe there are other ways to do that, but I'm here to advocate for the importance of reading. And I can't wait to hear your feedback and take your questions. So I guess I'll do that now.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for such an informative and lovely speech. We have several questions already. Let's start with, I recently found out that my friend has never read Pride and Prejudice or watched any of the movies her entire life. What is your advice to her? What do I tell her?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, first of all, and I'm getting more and more passionate about this point, please tell her not to watch the movies. I am finding more and more, because I love Jane Austen, and the more and more I am encountering people who also love Jane Austen, but the Jane Austen they love is different from the Jane Austen I love, because they love the movies. The movies are fine as movies, but they don't really capture what Jane Austen is doing, which is satirizing so many things in her culture, and the movies just usually end up being love stories, and that is not what Jane Austen is, even though there are love stories there. So I would recommend to anyone, if you really want to get someone in love with Jane Austen, which you should do, you should be an evangelist for Jane Austen, have them begin with Pride and Prejudice. That is, it's my favorite, but it's also, I think, the one that does what Jane Austen does so well, the best. Or I have published an edition of Sense and Sensibility that came out last year, where I have an introduction and discussion questions, and it's very much designed to help someone who's reading it for the first time to kind of know what to expect. People who don't know that Jane Austen is writing comedy and satire often don't know how to take the novels, because they think that they're supposed to be romantic novels, but they are hilarious. And once you know that, then you actually have a better time reading it. And then you can go and watch the movies and get that plot line that is about the love and romance. But most people who have only watched the movies don't really know what Jane Austen is doing. So that's my advice. A worthy effort indeed.
So interesting. I have to ask now, just a side note, if you had to pick one movie or one miniseries that would best describe Pride and Prejudice, what would you pick?
Well, again, I'm not a big, like, I've watched the movies once. I don't watch the movies over and over the way the fans do. So I guess, definitely not the one with Keira Knightley. That movie does not understand Pride and Prejudice at all. So probably the BB&C version. The Sense and Sensibility version with Emma Thompson is actually quite good. So that would be a good entree, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Next question would be, can you name 10 books? I know this is hard, but I'm just going to ask the question as it's written. Can you name 10 books that you would expect someone to have read who would like to be considered well-read?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many books that I haven't read. So I would say, okay, 10. I guess that's a decent number. So I would say, and also people need to understand that everyone's list would be different. My area of specialty is British literature, so that's my emphasis. But okay, so I would say Pride and Prejudice, The Scarlet Letter, The Great Gatsby, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, To Kill a Mockingbird, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Great Expectations, Huckleberry Finn. I lost count.
I think you're almost at 9.
Okay. Let's see, what else? 1984 and East of Eden.
Ooh, okay. I'm taking notes too.
That's all American and British. I didn't put in any Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. It's just, these are like English works. So yeah.
It's like someone trying to ask me what my favorite book is. I give them 5, and then I'm still conflicted. So I understand. What is the most misconstrued idea most people have about Jane Austen?
That she's romantic. That her stories are romances. They are comedies and they are satires. And she believes in marriage and she believes in love, and she has a conservative view of those things, which is why it's so important that the right people end up with the right people at the end. But she is, she's doing a lot more than writing love stories. She is gently critiquing the flaws in the church of the time, the flaws in the economic system that makes women so vulnerable, the flaws in women's education, and wrong-headed ideas about love and romance. So, yeah. I mean, if you read Pride and Prejudice, a good way to sort of understand what she's doing is to look at all of the marriages in the novel and judge them according to how much they are based on reason alone or passion alone, and which ones balance those virtuously.
Interesting. I do think I would like to read your companion book because I've read it, but it's been years, and so I'd like to go back over that one.
I should also mention that the Trinity Forum, where I'm a senior fellow, has just issued excerpts from Pride and Prejudice in a booklet form, and I have an introduction to that as well, which is, and you can buy the physical copy is a few dollars, or you can download a digital copy from the Trinity Forum website as well.
I'm always a downloader and printing out if I have to, or buying a print copy. I don't know. When you explained that, it was very interesting because I always feel that when I read a book, there's something very different, but I've never heard someone describe it like that. But it feels different to me. I can't get as involved in a book if it's, on a screen, and I never really knew why. But it's
just not your imagination. It's your brain.
It's just like innate. I'm like, I just reject this, and I don't know why, and I would never finish the book. Interesting. Someone would like to let you know that they loved learning about Hannah More and your fierce convictions. I don't know of her, which is on my list now to read. Can you tell us a little bit about Hannah More?
Oh, it's as though I planted the question, but I didn't, I promise. I would love to talk about Hannah More. So Hannah More was a British reformer and playwright and abolitionist. She started out, she lived from 1745 to 1833. She was a best friend to William Wilberforce. Most people have heard of William Wilberforce, but Hannah More was one of his dear friends who helped abolish the slave trade. Because she was a woman, she wasn't a member of the male abolitionist societies, but she was right there working alongside him. And she started out as sort of, a writer among the elite literati in London and a playwright and poet. But she had an evangelical conversion, I would say. Probably when she met John Newton, the author of The Former Slave Ship Captain, who wrote Amazing Grace. She went to hear him preach in his church. She read one of his books, and again, we have letters from her, but we don't. It's not like she went up on an altar call, but because she was born in the Church of England. But she became an evangelical, became friends with Wilberforce, and then at that point turned her writing toward the cause of abolition and other social reforms, and sort of abandoned, the celebrity life of the successful London writer, and became conservative, opened Sunday schools throughout her home region, where she taught the poor on Sundays to read and to do arithmetic, and taught them the catechism. This was before there were public schools, and so that was also part of her sort of conservative reform. She just was. She was a best-selling author of her time. She wrote a number of books, one novel, plays, poems. Lots of spiritual writings. Toward the end, her writing grew more and more spiritual and overtly Christian. She was one of the first ones to write a response to the French Revolution. She was waiting for Edmund Burke to do it, and she did it first because the men were too slow. And so she wrote against the atheism that undergirded the French Revolution. And
wow, I'm embarrassed to say that I had not heard of her. Wow, she's going to go on my list of conservative women I'd like to learn about. That's very...
Oh, absolutely. She must.
Wow, absolutely. Wow. Thank you so much for talking about her. Someone else would like to know, how much time do you spend reading a week?
A week? Yeah, I mean, of course, I do a lot of the reading on the screens. I am what Cal Newport calls a knowledge worker. So I'm always needing to be up to date on what's going on in the news, because part of my appointment, I'm an English professor, but I also teach Christian, in the area of culture and cultural engagement. So there's a lot of that, too much of that. And then, of course, I'm always, when I'm writing, I'm researching. So there are lots of books that I'm consulting, or if not reading cover to cover, for research. And so then I do try to keep a book that I'm reading for fun, for pleasure. Like right now, I'm reading David Copperfield. And again, I'm just being completely honest. The struggle is very real for me to sit down and read the book and not be checking my phone every 15 minutes for notifications and so forth. So I've never put a time on it, because that basically is my life. I mean, I teach, but when of course we've all been home more because of the pandemic, and when I'm home, I'm reading and writing. Because I write so much now, I don't read as much as I wish. I would be happy just reading, but mainly I read now for the things that I'm writing. And so I miss those years of my life when all I was doing was just like reading all the time. But it's a lot of time reading. So
Now, I had a professor tell me in college, she was from Germany, and she had commented that she noticed that students in American universities did not read as much when they were in university getting their bachelor's degree. And she just mentioned it was just so different. Do you think that this, the lack of reading, do you think that's something that's an American thing, or is it more of a worldwide situation?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I don't know how our reading compares to other countries. I'm sure there's research out there. I did a couple of years ago write an article for Academic Questions about the dramatic decline in the hours spent reading by Americans, but then also the hours that college students spend doing reading or any work. So it is definitely, I think it's part of the American college system. And that's a whole loaded conversation, but I think that, because basically the research that I have seen shows that everything about the college experience and expectations changed when the student loans increased. So that's when tuition went up like 10 times, while the rate of inflation went up 3 times. Tuition at private 4-year liberal arts schools went up 10 times. And it only went up that much because the government was making student loan money more widely available. And so it's become this big cycle where everyone's supposed to go to college. They get the money to go from the government, and then they get out and they can't get jobs to pay the loans back. And part of that is just simply that people are going to college now because they think that's necessary to get a good job, and they're not going to learn. So they just simply go to get, and then the classes become changed to meet the needs of those students. And so higher education is, essentially what's happening. And I'm not an expert. This is just I'm speaking from what I've researched and what I've experienced as someone who's been teaching college for 30 years, is that basically college has become a government subsidized high school education again. Like, we're just paying for high school again in a different form.
Wow. Well, that is it's not a startling critique, actually, but because I have seen a bit of this, and I was just wondering, it's sad.
Now, obviously there are exceptions at different schools and exceptions for different students and so forth, but essentially, and we're moving more and more to that when we talk about the forgiveness of loans. We're just basically seeing, a replication of high school again. And the government is paying for more and more of it, just as they do for public schools.
Ouch. Well, next question, different topic. Who is your favorite current American author, and why?
Who's my favorite current American? I don't know that okay, yes, George Saunders. George Saunders is my favorite current American author, and probably because he's a very, he's a rated, he's not for everyone. His writing is very hard in some ways. It's very literary, and it's also very disturbing. But what he does is he does it well, is he tries to see the perspective. He tells the story through the perspective of characters very different from him. Very different. I do have a chapter on one of his short stories on reading well. It's probably my favorite chapter in the book. And So George Saunders, he writes essays, he writes short stories, he's written a novel. He basically, empathy is his primary feature in his works. But he's also, experimental and a literary writer, and somewhat satirical as well. He has a lot to criticize about modern American materialist consumerist culture.
It's a big topic. There's a lot of room for I'm sure. How do audiobooks compare to reading a book or viewing it on a screen?
To reading what? A book?
The person asked, how do audiobooks compare to reading a book or viewing it on a screen?
Oh, okay. So I have looked a little bit at the research, and this is relatively, there hasn't been a lot of research that I found on this, but the research seems to indicate that when we listen to a book, it also uses the deeper recesses of the brain that we use when we're reading a print book. So that puts listening to Audible in the category, closer to the category of reading the print book than reading on a screen.
Okay. Next question would be, I didn't grow up reading. For me, it was movies and TV shows for entertainment. How do I learn to love reading?
That is such a good question. So again, using the muscle metaphor, keep in mind that if you're not good at reading and don't enjoy reading, that it takes time. You don't walk into the gym and start lifting the 50-pound weights right away. So realize that you have to give yourself time, and you have to take the time and start with books that both interest you and challenge you. So don't pick up a book that's making you miserable. Put that down and get a different one. But also don't pick up a book that's so, just fluffy. So pick up a good classic work of literature, or one that's won awards, that's on a topic that interests you. There are lots of ways, Ernest Hemingway writes really spare, minimal sentences, and he's a good writer. Charles Dickens writes really long, really complicated sentences, and he's a good writer. So you can certainly pick a style that you like, and because there's so many different ways, just like with painting, there are many different ways to be a painter and to paint pictures, and there are different ways for literary authors to use the medium of words to create a work of art. So find someone that does interest you and whose style you like. Cormac McCarthy is fine if he's very contemporary, very violent and harsh worlds that he paints. And if that interests you, that's okay, because he's actually a good writer. So anyone who has a reputation as a good writer who's writing literary works, give yourself time. Some people are goal oriented. I'm not someone who counts the number of books I read or anything like that, because I'm reading all the time, but maybe you can set a goal of a certain number of minutes a day. If it's 15 minutes a day at night before you go to sleep, you'll have a book read. And so just treat it like lifting weights, where you're allowing your brain and your attention span and your skill with literary language to develop and grow.
Okay. Speaking of that, and then how social media impacts us, do you think it's important for us to consider, obviously for various reasons, you consider how much time you spend on social media and engaging in that type of activity, but do you think it's more beneficial to become more of a reader, to lessen your time involved with social media or just reading online? Should you do that also to help your reading skills?
Yeah, so I think because I spend a lot of time online, I don't think that reading online helps your reading skills. I think if there's a metaphor that works, it's more like if you eat at McDonald's, you don't have an appetite, you're not hungry for the good food later, right? So I think you need to eat the good food and then get like a snack at McDonald's. So I think that reading good books and good works well helps us on social media. I think that helps, when I read a tweet that's poorly worded, or people who are saying something and I'm not sure that I agree with them or understand what they're saying, I think it's my wide reading that helps me not respond the way I see others, to just be like, huh, maybe he means something else, or, oh, maybe there's a bigger context here, or, oh, just to sort of have that wider perspective. That comes from the other kind of reading. But I think social media is more like, candy and junk food. And it doesn't really help our overall. It's fine to have. We can have candy and junk food, but it's not that healthy.
Maybe have less of it than the other
Yes.
items like you said. So I've heard people talk about, I'm just reading a question here, I've heard people talk about post-literate age. I wanted to ask you about that, but I'd like to tag onto that and say, if we are at a post-literate age, how do we as a culture and as conservative women, how do we engage and try to steer people back to reading? How do you do that?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to bring this up in the first part of my talk, and I guess it escaped me, but yes, most critics agree that we are in a post-literate age, and what that means is that we're not illiterate, but we just simply, literacy isn't our defining quality. We can read, but we don't read, or we don't exhibit the qualities of a literate culture. And I think that's true. And another part of that is something, we are basically in another dark age in some senses, because we have so much information that we actually can't tell what's true, right? I mean, you can go on one news outlet and find the news stories that support what you think, or you can go to another one and find opposite ones. So that's why we're constantly, all over social media, in our lives. We can find support for whatever we want. It seems we can't tell what's true. Even if we want to know what's true, it's almost impossible. We are so awash in information that we might as well be like in an age where there is no information. And we don't even know how to read that information critically. We don't know. I mean, I get in conversations where they don't know the difference between a news article and an editorial. They don't know an opinion piece versus, a piece of journalism. Now we can lay the blame and say, well, the media blurs those distinctions too. And that is somewhat true, but really, for the most part, the error is being made because we don't know the differences between those genres. So how do we change that? Wow. I mean, I think we have to patiently let people know when they are, demonstrating post-literacy or illiteracy. Sometimes I will have these conversations. If I share an article and someone will complain, I'll say, well, this is an opinion piece, or if they will say this isn't, they'll disagree with it. I'll say, well, why do you disagree with it? Just like help people think critically, help people engage more with the work. A lot of people they don't even know that you shouldn't pay attention to headlines. So they read a headline and they respond to the headline. And it's like, well, that is not even what the article said. Well, just assume that's not what if you're actually interested in the topic and want to know what it says, read the article, don't just read the headline. There's so much in our culture that mitigates against reading, let alone reading well, that I think being aware of that and guiding and helping and raising consciousness of it, even just in our conversations, is a start. But with that said, there's another parallel to the Dark Ages, and that is that, and that's a term that historians don't use anymore because it's offensive, but because there was really a lot going on in the Dark Ages that maybe we don't recognize now. But when it seemed like civilization was in decay around the world in that time period, the monks in the monasteries were preserving the written word. They were preserving the Bible. They were preserving biblical texts and letters and commentary. And if we are entering another dark age, it will be up to the people who are conservative to conserve this gift of literacy and the written word. And so we should be the last ones. We should not be the ones wanting to cancel anyone or any books or whatever. That should not be our job. We should be like Milton and encourage people to read promiscuously, to read widely, because you have to read the whole piece. But basically he says that if truth and falsehood grapple together, just let the field be open and truth will win. Now, we live in a post-truth culture, so that means that people don't even recognize truth when we see it. So that makes our job harder But if we want to censor or cancel, we have to know that anytime we support that, we're actually making it a greater risk that truth itself will be canceled or censored, and that is not what we want.
That is most assuredly what we do not want. We are coming up on our time, and so I guess I would consider that the last question, although I could personally ask like 10 more. But I would like to thank you so much for just speaking with us today and sharing these thoughts. I think this is very relevant for young women in college today, and it can really inspire anyone who happens to, follow our broadcast here. So anyhow, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us.